Hey, well, welcome everyone. It's so good to see your faces here in midsummer. I don't know if anyone else had a slight panic attack when Julie's email said we have 6 weeks until the beginning of the term, but we do indeed. Summer is flying by, and I'm glad that you're making time to be here today. We're going to talk about the course policies that were just announced last week and how that interfaces with the design that we've been working on over the course of the summer. So our hope for you today is that you'll be able to get some clarification over the classroom policies, that we'll be able to get in small groups and discuss some design options given the parameters that we will be teaching in, and then brainstorm some ideas for, in particular, using the face-to-face classroom space that we have available. So to begin today, we're going to do a poll through Zoom, and we tried this for the first time last week, and we'll go ahead and do it again today. But I'm going to share a poll with you in just a moment that's going to ask you to identify, and you can select more than one, the classroom policies that are challenging your thinking a little bit when it comes to your design. So you should see the poll. If you don't see it, make sure that Zoom is clicked as your primary screen on your computer, because it shows up as a kind of a pop-up over the Zoom interface. So give yourself some time. I know the answers are lengthy, but they came just from that document from our Classroom Policies Committee. So again, you can choose any of them, all of them, whichever ones that you think are on your mind as you're designing your courses.
And for those of you who were joined in while Sarah was describing the poll, we're just taking a quick look at what are some of the classroom policies that just came out that you're recognizing this is going to actually be a little challenging for me in my particular course. If you can go ahead and weigh in, we've got 4 out of 20 of you, 20% has voted so far. And so go ahead and continue reading through the different policies. And as you have the opportunity to vote, that would be fantastic. We're up to about 35% now. And so keep on voting as you can. Thanks for starting to put things in the chat. This is fantastic. I am with you. Staying in my tape box is going to actually be quite challenging. I love moving around the classroom, and that is going to be tricky. Good. Yeah, there's going to be time lost enforcing these things, and I'm hoping it's time well spent. Good. What other things? Keep it coming.
Leave the poll open for about another 30 seconds or so. I think most of us have had a chance to vote. And then we'll take a look at the results here. So can you all see the results? Okay, so our top response, which is roughly half of us, talking about the difficulty that it's going to be to have all of our learning objectives accomplished online. That's the top one, followed by making sure that the course is accomplishable by a student who's face-to-face in your classroom and also virtual. Trying to figure out how to engage students so that those that are in real time, so the synchronous engagement can happen between all the students in the classroom is a concern. Let's see what are our other big ones. Oh, so absences and assignments, right? Trying to figure out how to make that happen when students are expected to participate in both places. And then from a chair standpoint, some of these illness questions, right? If we get sick, it's going to fall to our departments, and that's going to make it hard for the classes to be covered if everyone is sick in particular. I think we all know how hard it is to pick up somebody else's course in the middle of the semester, let alone 7 or 8 people's courses in the middle of a semester. So that's a real concern here. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing the poll results. Hopefully you guys can see that you're not alone in the concerns that you have. And we're going to probably spend most of our time on addressing the top 2 concerns today, which is about how do we address both populations of students and make sure all of our learning objectives are able to be accomplished online. So with that in mind, we're going to open up our session with a little bit of Q&A on some of the classroom policies. So Charisse was a part of the Classroom Policies Committee. There were several other faculty on that committee as well, but I asked Charisse if she'd be willing to come today to give some information about the policies and then also answer any of your questions before we dive into planning around them, because it's important that we really understand the policy before we start using it for design. So Charisse, I'll let you give a little short overview, and then as you guys have questions, you can start entering them into the chat, and then Christine and I will help facilitate those questions being asked, and then Charisse can answer them.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I was on the committee, and I mean, as we know often happens when there are committees, there were some changes that were made. Like, we had submitted our recommendations basically to the administration, and there were some not huge but minor changes that were made between what we submitted and what was actually released. So there may be a few things that I'm like, you know, I'm not quite sure the rationale behind that, but I think for the majority of the things, I can at least reflect on some of the reasoning behind them or ways that we were discussing, like what this might look like and things like that. So happy to take questions from people. Okay. So the email from Julie said faculty must meet regularly with students face-to-face. It says this can be done in person or virtually. Does that mean that face-to-face classes could be done entirely or mostly online? So this, so thanks, Stephen, for the question. This is one of those that they were working on kind of like modifying a little bit after we had submitted our initial recommendations. And so my understanding on the policy as we were discussing it is that, so at the beginning of the summer when they sent out that poll and they asked faculty, you know, do you want to teach your courses completely online, or are you like willing to do some or doing the face-to-face thing? So my understanding is that the faculty who initially said, hey, I am teaching online, they've been told that they can do that. With the hope being, I think, that the rest of faculty are going to have kind of a face-to-face component to the class. Now, I think a key word there is regularly. So we had kind of, we unpacked like, what does regularly mean? And in the end, they sort of landed on regularly because it is flexible, but I think the idea that there's a hope that, you know, at least once a week or so, roughly, that there would be some sort of engagement between, some sort of synchronous engagement between faculty and students. And that would probably be face-to-face engagement because of the fact that, you know, for those of us that said we were going to teach face-to-face, then that would probably be face-to-face engagement. That said, when they came out with that revision, I also noticed that it had that kind of either or language in it. Excuse me, turn off my notifications quickly. I noticed that it had that either or language in it as well, but that wasn't something that necessarily was put forth from our committee specifically. And so I guess this is not a great answer to your question, but I too would be interested in knowing specifically what that means. But I think the expectation is that students are expecting a hybrid course. And so faculty who said they were going to teach a hybrid course should be teaching a hybrid course. That's my understanding. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Charisse, going into the chat, the next question that kind of came in is any suggestions on how to include the students who choose to only be virtual if the professor is choosing in-class engagement for face-to-face? And that is one of the things we have been talking about. And so if you wanted to move on to something else, we could move on to that now. Otherwise, we can pause and sit with this chat question right now.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I'll admit that every time, so because there was also the pedagogy group and then there was the policy group, anytime we kind of veered on that conversation at all, we kind of went, wait a minute, that's more of a like a pedagogy type question. And so we would sort of halt the conversation to discuss the policies. That said, it's not that that conversation didn't happen. And so we have kind of our own ideas, but I'll maybe delay answering that for a little bit, because I think a little bit later, there's some time set aside to talk about how I've thought about this for my own classes, and that might be a good opportunity to talk about those things.
Yeah, I think these other questions are awesome, and I think that we will get to them. So Leah, your question, Julie, yours, your second one, and Rachel, yours as well. I think that we'll get to those as we start exploring some of the pedagogy and the design questions. I think the one that we could probably use a little bit of clarification on is what is the expectation regarding managing our two student population? So we'll have some that are virtual all the time, perhaps for the entire semester, and we will have some that are face-to-face, maybe once a week, maybe split, those types of things. So how do we, how did the policy group kind of think about managing those two groups? And then also Melissa's asking, there might be students who want to be face-to-face, but then eventually opt into being virtual for various reasons. So kind of what might that look like? Do students have to declare at the beginning of the semester whether they're going to be fully virtual or fully face-to-face? Can you give us a little insight on that, Charisse?
Yeah, I think going through making all these policies, I mean, we had discussions about like, oh, so what if we have a student that's either medically vulnerable or maybe just doesn't feel comfortable being on campus and they want to take their courses online? And so there was conversation that went back and forth about that, like maybe they need to take only online classes or that sort of thing. But in some departments, that's just not feasible for students to be able to continue with their major taking only online courses. And so eventually what it came to is, again, because I see, like, for example, some like Melissa's point in the chat about even some students who wanted to be face-to-face might suddenly not be able to, we recognize that either way, we were going to have to be prepared to meet the needs of students who either didn't want to come to class because there are concerns about COVID on campus, because they're medically vulnerable, or because maybe they were coming to class to participate face-to-face and then suddenly had to quarantine because of contact, or they became sick or something like that. And so it is expected that, that the courses will be designed in such a way that students potentially could participate online all semester long. And so that does certainly require some adaptability on our part as faculty. I will say that I was really, really grateful for, Debus T and Ray Van Aragon, and having these conversations in trying to, I think in some ways it's easy to look at the policies and feel like, oh my goodness, this is so restrictive. We can't move around the classroom and we can't, it feels so restrictive. But we also reached out and had I had reached out to people from other universities and asking what was going on. And I actually had immense gratitude for the degree to which those on the committee and administration on the committee were trying really hard to not pigeonhole us into doing one specific thing, like trying to write the policies in such a way that we could be like, okay, how can I be creative with my particular course content? And that we weren't completely restricted to lecturing with a simultaneous virtual presentation of our lecture. Because for some classes that just doesn't work. And so where you might feel like some of these are like, oh, it feels a little bit vague. Some of that is coming from the purpose of making sure that we're leaving enough room in these policies for people to be able to go, okay, well, for this particular project, it's going to work best if I do this, and maybe think outside the box a little bit. So I realize that's not a direct answer to the question, but I think it's relevant.
It's fantastic. You guys have great questions. We're going to talk a little bit more probably about them in our groups as we're working later on, but I don't want to spend all of our time on the questions. I want to make sure that we get to talking a little bit about the pedagogy, and then we will get into the discussions a little bit more as we move forward. So I think at this point we will transition, if that's okay with Christine and Charisse, on to the others, or did we miss something, Christine, that you want to hit on?
You know, I think one thing that is really helpful to just have be as clear as possible is that a lot of faculty are asking, what do we do with the students who are not in the classroom, and how do we get material to them later? This is not a enjoyable answer, but it is a direct answer. The easiest way for you to get your course content to your students who were not there during the class period for whatever is to record yourself via Zoom while you're teaching. This terrifies some teachers because they don't typically script their statements, and they don't really want to have a recording of their teaching that's going out there. However, it is expected that all content can be delivered to our students. And so for those of you who are like, I don't want to record myself while I'm teaching, we still have to get the students the content. And so after class is over, you can go back and you can create something after class is done to be sent out to students so they feel caught up. We have also covered in our brown bags ways to be able to keep a record of what's happening in class using shared Google documents, using other tools, and we've covered those already during our brown bags. And so I'm sorry we might not get into all the details of how to do that, but the clear piece is if you are delivering content, it has to be able to be delivered to all students. The easiest way is to record yourself. If you don't want to record yourself, then it might require some either different strategies for in class, or you might need to create additional material to be delivered asynchronously after class is over. Sara, would you have anything that you would add to that to make that more clear?
No, I think the only thing I would say is just we need to change the lens through which we're viewing our classes, right? We usually design with the face-to-face classroom in mind. And in this instance, we have to design with the online mind first. And then when we do that, we think about how we're going to have students interact, right? We talked about this in the beginning, interact with ourselves, interact with the content, interact with each other. And we have to do that from a virtual platform. And so in the wording of the policies, it says that every learning outcome needs to be met online, and that we should augment our classroom face-to-face time in additional ways that will enhance and supplement learning. But that's not the place primarily for new content to be delivered. Now, I'll caveat that and say you can record yourself in the classroom, but we want to also think about from a design standpoint how we might design our instruction for this semester where we're starting from the online platform. And we'll talk about that next. But I think that's the piece that got lost initially when we started talking about modified face-to-face. I'd still put the emphasis on face-to-face for good reason, right? We do want that face-to-face interaction, but for our standpoint from a design place, we need to design for an online course. This helps us not only if we get sick, right? Because our course can continue to run without needing somebody, another colleague of ours to step in and create the content, right? The content would already be there for our colleagues to just keep moving. And then secondly, it also helps if our students are getting sick or we need to slow or change the pace, right? It's there and it's accessible and people can work through it at their own point in time. So that's what I would add to that, Christine, is just keep thinking about this being a virtual class, really.
And just to add to that, Sara, actually, I would agree that, like, just in terms of making your life easy in terms of these policies, I mean, for your own benefit, I think it's easiest to think about it as an online class that has some supplemental face-to-face stuff with it. just for your own like sanity throughout the course of the semester. And I know that can be pretty overwhelming because a lot of us aren't that familiar with teaching online. Of course, we all got a little dose of that last spring, but still, I think it's easiest to think of it that way. And then you're supplementing with some face-to-face stuff here and there. I noticed that Melissa put into the chat box that she was, and I think it actually, and then I think Kristen posted the YouTube video that I was thinking of that Melissa had shared with me earlier, about kind of like the Zoom high flex model and thinking about it first as an online course. And I think that Melissa's chat about how she plans to do, I won't read it, I'll let you take a look at it, highlights the ways in which this could be flexible. So you have to think about your own course content and think about like, okay, what's the best way that I could do this? Thinking about it first as an online course, and then thinking about how you could implement it, like keeping with the policies, of course, but then add some face-to-face component to it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So the next thing that I want you to think about before we transition into hearing some examples from Charisse and then getting into a breakout room is just identifying for yourself as you are considering and weighing out your design, like where is your hang up, right? If there was one spot in your design where you're like, I'm stuck, where is that stuck point for you? Can you identify for yourself, where are you hitting the wall? And then you can jot kind of where that is in the chat as you come to it. So just some kind of group dumping of our sticking points. We'll do that for about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move on to some examples thereafter. So again, just jot your sticking points in the classroom. I sent mine in there. Good. Technology. How to get in touch with students who aren't responsive on the technology front. Good. Yeah, lab experiences that use human subjects. Okay, so thanks for thinking about your sticking points. You can keep jumping into the chat window with those. And then we're gonna kind of zoom in to fall 2020, and Charisse is gonna talk a little bit about how she is thinking about course design for a couple of her courses. Again, asked her to do this because she's been thinking about these policies a lot longer than we have, as she's been on the committee. So Charisse, thanks for talking a little bit about your design choices. You're muted, Charisse. We still can't hear you.
Sorry,
there we go.
I was wondering if you could click to my first point. I shouldn't have animated it, but I did. Okay, great. I just wanted to point at one thing. I noticed there's some questions in there about students who are participating completely asynchronously. And I think, and I'm sort of speaking on behalf of myself right now, but if I had a student that all semester long was participating completely asynchronously, I would probably have a conversation with student life about that. because I do think it is the hope that students, even if they're attending virtually, would participate synchronously at the time that they were supposed to participate in their class. And that if that wasn't happening for some reason, that there's some sort of obstacle, whether it be like an internet challenge, a computer challenge, or something like that, that I would hope that maybe Bethel would be able to step up and help solve that issue for that particular student. So anyways, that's my one comment about that. But I think especially that we don't necessarily have a requirement to record the content that we're providing, I do think it is the hope that that the students will be participating synchronously mostly throughout the semester. But then you might have, a student who gets COVID and they're out for 2 weeks or something like that. And so that's kind of where we're saying, okay, well, it would be nice to have something recorded. Just in the same way, if a student missed class, we would tell them like, try to get the content from another student or something like that, but we're trying to be a bit more helpful because the time that they're gone might be longer. Okay, so in terms of thinking about my own course design for this coming semester, I had a few things in mind for very different classes, so I thought I would just share. So if you go to the next bullet point for it, in fact, you can probably just make them all show up. That'll just be easier. Okay, so one, I'm teaching a split stats course. So I have a course of 25 students that's been divided into 2. We had to think a lot about this because this stats course is usually a flipped classroom. So the students are watching kind of a mini video before they come to class, and then what they do in class is very, very interactive. And so for this class, it was really, really helpful for me, I think, to think first about how I would teach it online, and then try to implement that from a classroom perspective. In part because as some of you had pointed out, I know Julie had mentioned earlier, like we can't really walk around very easily in the classroom. And my particular stats course involves a lot of coding. And so it's like, well, if a student gets stuck in their code, how am I going to help them? And in this course, I usually have students form these kind of like mini groups of people, which I'm inclined to call pods now because of coronavirus. Anyways, they have mini groups of students that they work with throughout the whole semester long, and they kind of support each other in troubleshooting their code. Well, if the students can't get within 6 feet of one another, and I really can't come within 6 feet of the students, then how am I going to support them in this? And so we actually had a meeting with a bunch of people who teach this curriculum across the whole country to brainstorm and share ideas of what this might look like. And I think it comes back to the idea of thinking of it first as an online course and how that might be implemented, and then secondary, how you could supplement that in a face-to-face content. And so one idea that we had is that actually both students who are not present, but also students who are present, can be using Zoom. All that really needs to be happening is that they have a pair of headphones. And so even our small groups of students would be able to interact in small groups with one another on Zoom, even if they're in the classroom, so that they would be able to help each other troubleshoot their code. And in some ways, and this is where I'm saying like, it's useful, I think, to have some creativity and think outside the box, because that actually led us to the point of like, that might actually be useful even in a non-COVID situation, because they can share their screens with one another and they can, do things that they might not otherwise be able to do. And so from that perspective, it actually might work really, really nicely to do it that way. And then the whole class can be participating in the same Zoom session. So that's one thing that we've been thinking about. If you haven't seen yet, there was an email that came out from Julie Finner today talking about I can't remember the exact term she used, but I think kind of like an instructional TA. So there's been additional funding that's been approved to provide additional TA hours to faculty, because it will be hard to manage an in-person classroom at the same time that you're monitoring a synchronous Zoom session. And so I think faculty will be able to request to use one of these kind of instructional TAs that will help take care of the Zoom aspect of things. I know there was some people who said like, well, what if the students in Zoom can't hear the faculty? Well, remember that you're going to be kind of confined to this box that's near the computer anyways. So they should be able to hear you because you won't be doing much moving around the classroom. So anyways, for this stats course, because it's a flipped course, what we're actually hoping to do is have the students, like for example, in this class, we might tell all of the students like, look, by Wednesday, it's expected that you are going to go through this particular content. We might record a video of us going through the code so that they can try it out on their own. So we're providing a little bit of additional upon what we would normally. And then we would meet with half the students live on Wednesday and half the students live on Friday. And then during those times, we would be there to support them in person, but the other students would be able to still attend via Zoom. And that would be the flipped portion of the classroom where it's like, okay, you've got your assignment, you're working on it. We also have, for that course, we have additional TAs that we use to support that content. And so they could go into the Zoom breakout sessions and help students as they're getting stuck. And the nice thing about that is then all the students are getting to see these things. So they might actually learn a little bit more that way than they would have otherwise. So my second one is a non-split classroom that's fairly content-heavy physiological psychology course. So in this one, because it's fairly content-heavy, it's a little bit easier to and because it's not split, it's a little bit easier to envision what this might look like. But still, I have to operate on the assumption that there's going to be some students that don't plan on coming to the classroom because they're medically vulnerable or for some other reason. In which case, I need to make sure that my lecture slides are available in Zoom and those students can participate synchronously. Ideally, I would record those sessions. And then there's some little things that we're going to have to get used to. So if a student in the classroom asks the question, I need to get in a really good habit of repeating that question so the students who are participating via Zoom can hear what the question was. So there's a few things that we're going to have to kind of get a little bit accustomed to. And then finally, a physiological psychology lab that doesn't have social distancing in the sense that it does, but there is no 6-foot requirement for the labs. So in terms of what that's going to look like, so for the labs, the reason why we can't implement a 6 feet of social distance is because oftentimes the students have to be working together. Like the labs that we're doing, you have one person that's the participant and the rest of the people are collecting data on that participant. So there's really no other way to do it. So the students are going to have masks and they're going to have shields as long as it doesn't pose a safety hazard of some kind. But I'm just going to minimize the amount of time that they're close together as much as possible. So that might look different in different weeks. So for example, I might have one week that's a fairly long lab, in which case I have the students kind of separated at first as best I can, where we talk about the setup and go through a little bit of content. But then when they come together to do their lab, then they're going to have to come together, asking them they're all going to have to disinfect their equipment before they start, to maintain distance whenever they can, and of course, make sure that they're not taking off their masks and their shields. I might have another lab that I know is kind of a shorter lab, in which case I might be able to stagger it, where I say like, okay, one half the students, you guys come first, you're going to do it. You're going to finish, you're going to disinfect everything, and then the second half of the students is going to come. And so any way that you can do that to have as few students in the classroom as possible, I think is better. So there's different ways to think about it, and I think it's just trying to be able to imagine what is your course content, what might be the best way to do it online, and then how can you add some supplemental, like really great face-to-face components to go with that. So yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions that people have.
Yeah, thanks, Charisse.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody has any questions, you can jot them in the chat. Otherwise, I'd really like to get us into breakout rooms so we can have some conversation. But the one thing that I did want to say is, Charisse, when you were talking about your split stats course and having students kind of be in the room and using Zoom at the same time, this can come in many forms. Like you talked about the Zoom example, but we can also use apps like GroupMe or using some direct messaging apps through our email, right? We can do a Google Chat. So that can be accomplished in a wide variety of ways. And I think it's good to have a couple of options in front of us. We're in the process right now of testing out some IT on campus, and we may not have enough access points for every student to be on Zoom in the face-to-face classroom at the same time, like having small group discussions, but we should have enough access points for all students to be able to use a Google document or a chat feature, something absent like video, for example, and that might be useful to kind of tuck away as you guys are in the planning phase.
I think Google Docs is going to be really, really huge, because it's something that whether they're in the classroom or they're participating from home or even asynchronously, every student can access. So being able to do that, I think is going to be huge, at least in the class. I know I'm going to use it a lot in my courses.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. There's Sharice's take-home message. Sorry, I didn't get that up sooner.
That's okay.
So I have 3 questions for us as we head into the discussion session. And I'm actually using a Harvard thinking routine. So for those of you who were here last week, we introduced Harvard thinking routines. And so I'm going to use one for us today. But when you get into your breakout sessions today, I want you to think about how the classroom policies connect with what you were already planning to do. So many of you have been in this planning stage for several weeks already. So what things line up really nicely with your design already? Then what challenges, right, are you running into because of some of the policies? And then what new ideas or resources are you exploring, or would you like help or support with as you move forward? So I'm going to, in the chat, place the link to our Google document. It should be pretty familiar to most of you at this point. And in that Google document, once you get into your group, you can grab one of the areas for writing. The prompts, again, are up at the top of that Google document. And then you can just take a couple of notes. And Christine, I'll let you give the instructions for beaming us out.